Hello. Haven't made a new guide for a while. I wanted to make a more basic guide on how to get started in solo PvP this time. I don't have any great fights to show or anything, and this is intended mostly for an audience who has little to no PvP experience. I started off living in low sec and doing a lot of frigate PvP when I started playing this game, so that's what this guide will focus on. I still personally think that it's a great way to get started. Maybe I'll first start by asking, why would you even want to do solo PvP in EVE in the first place? Because it's actually a good question, because EVE has no mechanics in place to force a fair fight. There's no way to prevent from being blobbed, or having someone outship you, or someone using links against you, or someone bringing a falcon ult against you. So a lot of people think that because of that, it's pointless to even try. I personally, I don't agree with this at all. I've been doing solo PvP as my primary activity in EVE for the last 2 years. Over that time, I have far more kills than losses. I usually don't fly with links, and I don't think that I'm very good at this game, to be perfectly honest. So if I can do it, so can you. But more specifically, I think if you become a competent solo PvPer, that the best thing is that you always have access to content. You don't need to wait for an FC to log on to take out a roam. You don't need to wait for other people to log on to roam with you. You can just grab a ship and go on your own schedule and on your own terms. And if you want to end your roam early, you can. You can just dock up and end it. So because of that, I think solo PvP in EVE is actually very accessible for casual playstyles and people who have only limited amounts of time to play the game but still want to kill things. Another thing is that solo PvP forces you to learn more about the game and be a better player. You alone are responsible for all your successes and failures, really. And I think that's important because most fights in EVE are won simply by having better ships, or one side just having greater numbers, and in that case often your presence just makes no difference at all in the outcome, and to me that's just not very satisfying at all. I'd rather be responsible for my own wins and losses in this game. So the ship I've chosen for this video is the Executioner that's fit with beam lasers. It's kind of a good low sec solo frigate. The specific ship doesn't really matter that much, though, for the purposes of this guide. There are a lot of ships out there that are viable, that are very similar to this one. If you ever want a good fit for a different ship, you can always just ask me and I'll give one to you. But the only reason I've picked this ship is that it's just what I've been flying recently, because not that long ago CCP buffed small beam lasers pretty significantly. And before this, small beam lasers used to be one of the worst weapon systems in the game, so kind of as a way to test out the new fits that are available to me, I chose this ship and just started flying it with beam lasers, and I think it's quite good for low-sec frigate dueling. A very common piece of advice for people who want to learn how to solo PvP is to go buy 10 frigates, take them out to faction warfare low-sec, and just lose them all. I think that's good advice, if not a bit incomplete. The only way to learn is to get out there and do it, bottom line. But at the same time, you need to be able to reflect upon your losses and learn from them. Because, I mean, if you just lose ships, any idiot can just lose a ship. I mean, you don't really accomplish anything. So I do strongly urge you to... I do think that's good advice. I do think you should just buy a bunch of frigates and go out there and do it. This is a good ship to do it with. But first rule, I guess, is to make sure that you're aware of what you're doing, and that after each fight you reflect upon it and try to learn something from it. I will say that knowledge of the game and just very, very basic piloting ability usually determine whether you win or lose. Skill points, skill points do matter, but skill points are much less important, in my opinion, and in my experience. I started winning fights in frigate duels with some level of consistency when this character had roughly 6 million skill points, I think. I don't remember exactly. And there are a lot of, I guess, very famous videos with people who have much lower skill points than even that who go out and win fights. So it's really more about understanding the mechanics of the game, understanding the capabilities of your ship and those of your opponents that are going to determine the outcome of the fight. So to illustrate this point, let me show you a fight that I had in the very first roam I did with this Executioner. I found a Prophecy who was being flown by a pretty new character. He was actually less than 2 months old, and he was doing faction warfare missions in low sec. So that tells me a few things. He clearly didn't have the skills necessary to fly the ship anywhere close to its full potential. I mean, a Prophecy is a battlecruiser. It takes several months of just focused training in order to have a really solid PvP fit with this ship. And the fact that he was doing faction warfare missions in low sec, I think, shows a lack of experience on his part, because actually it's a very, very dangerous thing for him to be doing, because literally anybody can just come and gank you. And people will very rarely do them in a ship like a Prophecy for that reason. I mean, people usually do them in stealth bombers or other cloaky ships. And he probably doesn't realize just how dangerous it is, which I think just shows a lack of experience. And I also guess that because he was doing missions, he was probably going to be fit for PvE, and he would likely not be able to fight back effectively. So, considering all of that, it's actually very possible for a simple T1 frigate like this Executioner to kill a Prophecy, even though it's 3 ship classes above mine. So really all I have to do is just orbit close to him so that his guns can't track me. He's actually using lasers on this ship. And I just have to kill off all his drones one by one, which are really the only threat to me. And once all his drones are dead, he just has no means to fight back, and it's a very simple kill. So the point is, because he's not a very experienced player and he didn't fit his ship well, it doesn't matter that he's flying a more powerful ship and more expensive ship than me. This is still a pretty simple kill. So I'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of solo low-sec PvP in faction warfare space. So the good things about low-sec are that the logistics are fairly easy. I mean, typically you have ready access to Empire space. You can stage one jump out of high-sec, for example, often pretty close to a trade hub. So restocking your ships or resupplying is actually fairly simple. The second advantage is that because there's no bubbles in low sec, you're very unlikely to lose your pod. I mean, eventually you'll get unlucky and lose your pod to a smart bomber or something, but if you want to stay in learning implants to keep your skill training going faster, you can do so in low sec without much fear of losing your pod. But more importantly, I think that the best things about PvP and low sec are that there are more solo pilots around, so it's fairly easy to get a 1 versus 1 fight. If you go out in a frigate just looking for fights, there are a lot of other people who are going to be doing the same thing as you, so it's comparatively easy in low sec compared to, say, null sec, and especially wormhole space, to get a good 1 versus 1 fight. You can also use novice plexes to force fights against other frigates to help prevent people from outshipping you, at least to some extent. It doesn't solve all those problems, because people can still get pirate frigates inside. And also, I think low-sec faction warfare space is fairly densely populated compared to most of null-sec. So because of that, you can get a good number of fights per hour. I mean, it's just really, really easy to get fights, I think, and that's really important when you're learning, is that you just want to get as many fights as possible so that you can get more practice in. The downsides of PvP and low sec, I think there are a couple. One is that if you want to still be able to access high sec, maintaining your security status can be pretty annoying. But a lot of people just decide that they just don't care. They're just gonna completely forsake high sec and just use alts to hollow their stuff and whatnot. But if you want to be able to continue to access high sec in order to run missions or something, then this can be a bit of a problem. Fortunately, clone soldier tags exist now. They're a thing, so you can buy your sec status up, but for a new player, that can very quickly get expensive. Another thing to consider is that the frigate PvP in low sec is the meta is a bit different than what you'll find in null sec. Frigate PvP is driven by the faction warfare plex mechanics, and that can make the meta a bit stale. So a lot of the skills you'll learn and a lot of the fits you'll use when doing PvP in null sec don't always translate 100% to doing PvP in other regions or other space, especially null sec. It's very, very different from the style of nullsec frigate PvP, where you don't have fights taking place at plexes and you don't have gate guns. It's a much more dynamic environment there. And also kind of connected to my first point that you're unlikely to lose your pod, pilots are more likely to be using expensive pirate implants, which actually give you a fairly significant edge in PvP. And also people are more likely to be using off-grid link alts in low sec, which puts you at a fairly big disadvantage. It's far from the case where everybody you'll fight will be using them, but you'll definitely encounter this if you PvP in low sec, and it's a bit unfortunate, but it's just something that you're going to have to deal with and accept as a reality. Also, there are a lot of dishonorable people in EVE and in low sec in general, and some people will hide like Griffin alts inside of plexes who will just jam you out so that you can't have no chance of winning. Similar with like say a Bantam alt or some other type of Logi frigate, or sometimes now the combat recons don't show up on D-scan. People will hide combat recons inside of medium plexes. Like you think you're going in to fight a Rifter 1 versus 1 and all of a sudden there's a curse 20 kilometers away from you and you're kind of screwed. Again, it's not super common. It's not something I run into every day, but it does happen, and it's unfortunate, but it's a reality of not just low sec PvP, but just of EVE in general. So now talk a little bit about the fight itself. When the fight is started, when the fight's happening, the biggest thing that determines the outcome of a fight is the range and your ability to control range to be at the range that you want. So a classic example is, say, the brawling ship versus the kiting ship. So the brawling ship, like, say, a Blaster Tyrannus or a Blaster Comet or something like that, wants the fight to be basically just at point-blank range, less than 5 kilometers. Whereas the kiting ship wants to be outside of this range. He wants to be at a range where the brawler can't hit him, where the brawler can't catch him, but where he can still apply all his damage. So, and whichever of these ships is able to dictate the range that he wants to be at is going to win the fight, like 90% of the time. It's the single most important thing, and it's really what PvP and EVE is all about. So how do you control range? The first two things to consider are the prop mod of your ship and the tackle that you're carrying. So in terms of your prop mod, you have two choices really. You have a Microwarpdrive or an Afterburner. A Microwarpdrive gives a very large speed increase, but it's shut off by warp scramblers, whereas an Afterburner gives a still significant but much smaller speed increase than a Microwarpdrive, but it still works when scrambled. And those are the important things to consider. In terms of the tackle, the important tackle mods are going to be a warp scrambler and a web. A warp scrambler shuts off a Microwarpdrive. It does not shut off an Afterburner. And a web just gives us a flat 60% speed reduction to its target. I mean, whether it has a Microwarpdrive or an Afterburner, it doesn't matter. It's just a flat 60% speed reduction. So the prop mod and the tackle mods that are on the ship are usually what dominates your ability to control range. In a case where, I mean, what's also important is the base speed of your ship and your piloting ability. In cases where, like, say, you have two ships which have the same prop mod and the same tackle mods, then what then determines range is usually the base speed of the ship. So the faster the ship, the more ability it has to control range. So let's talk about an Afterburner versus a Microwarpdrive in the context of low-sec frigate PvP. The thing to consider is that most fights in faction warfare at low-sec will happen at faction warfare plexes. This is mostly because of the fact that there are gate and station guns, so you can't really fight in the usual locations like gates or off the stations, because if you do and you aggress the wrong target, then you'll just get nuked by the gate guns. And because of this, the pilot who's waiting inside of a plex, he gets to decide the range at which the fight starts, because basically there's just a beacon inside the plex, and when you take the acceleration gate, you land at this beacon. So the pilot who's inside the plex gets to orbit the beacon basically at whatever range he wants, and he gets to decide the range at which the fight starts. So, and that puts him at a fairly sizable advantage in many cases. If you're this guy inside the plex just waiting for people to come into you, to come fight you, then fitting an Afterburner, a Warp Scrambler, and a Web as your prop mod and your tackle mods is a very, very strong combination, and this is extremely common in low sec for this reason. So basically, the good thing about fitting a Scram is basically if you want to start the fight in Scram range, you can. I mean, you can basically just sit on the beacon at 0, and if a kiting ship takes the gate and comes in to fight you, you insta-Scram him, and he's going to lose because his ship's not designed to fight within Scram range in most cases. Fitting an Afterburner and a Web, also in this case, if you accept that the fight's going to start within Scram range, then ideally you're going to want to have an Afterburner fit to your ship, because if you have a Microwarpdrive, then basically just getting scrammed in return is going to shut off your prop mod. It's going to make your prop mod completely useless. And if you're a Microwarpdrive ship and you're fighting against an Afterburner ship, you just have no way to control range because his prop mod is going to work while yours is not. So for that reason, like the whole meta in low sec kind of revolves around fitting an Afterburner. Almost everybody fits an Afterburner in most cases, unless they're long-range kiting ships. And the Web, of course. Web is always good. If you're within Scram range, you're within Web range. So having this Web will give you an extra mod to help you control range. And if you don't have a Web and your opponent does, then he's going to be able to control range and you're not. So that's the advantage of this Afterburner Scram Web combination. These are the 3 mods that are going to be on the ship that I'm using for this guide. And this is a very strong combination for range control, and this alone will help you win a lot of fights. The disadvantage of this is that AB fit ships are much slower than Microwarpdrive ships, and because of this, they're fairly bad at engaging gangs, like one versus many type of fights. You can't really split up targets very well. You can't do on-grid separation like you can with a Microwarpdrive ship. And you also, if you find yourself in a match against a long-range kiting ship, it's extremely difficult. You have to almost have to get very lucky, or your opponent has to be bad in order to successfully slingshot a kiting ship. If you're in an Afterburner fit ship, whereas if you're in a Microwarpdrive brawling ship, it's very, very easy to slingshot kiters. So these are the disadvantages of fitting an Afterburner, but the fact that the Plex mechanics can force a fight to start at basically 0 range usually means that Afterburner fit ships dominate. So speaking of very general terms, there's 3 classes of ship, I guess, that you'll encounter if you're doing Frigate PvP. The first class of ships are the Brawlers. So these are blaster fit ships or autocannon fit ships, like a Merlin, Incursus, a Comet, or an Atron are good examples of blaster ships. Good examples of autocannon fit ships are the Rifter, the Slasher, or the Firetail. And these ships do the most damage. They have the best tracking, but they also, as a trade-off, they have the lowest range. So their ideal range is typically basically as small as possible. Usually anywhere within 0 to 3 kilometers is good for these. This is very short range, but if they're able to get on top of a target and maintain this range, then usually their target will die very fast. And they usually, I mean, almost always will fit a Warp Scrambler in their Web, but they can fit either a Microwarpdrive or an Afterburner. A Microwarpdrive makes them better at chasing down and killing kiting ships, whereas an Afterburner is better against other ships which are carrying scrams, because it'll allow them to close range against their target much better. The second class of ship, and this is the actual ship I'm using in this video, is the Scram-Kiters. So these are fits that use either railguns, lasers, or rockets typically. railgun ships, I mean the same ships that were blaster brawlers, can also be Scram-Kiters when they're fit with railguns. So the Merlin, Incursus, Comet, and Atron can all be good Scram-Kiting ships. Most laser fit ships are also very good Scram-Kiters because Scorch ammo lets them hit to the edge of scram range. Among the T1 frigates, these are the Executioner and the Tormentor. Rockets also are very good ships for Scram-Kiters. These are the Hookbill, the Breacher, and the Kestrel. So the ideal range for this class of ship is about 7 to 8 kilometers, which is still within scram range, but it's the very edge of scram range. You typically want to be as close to the edge of scram range as they can possibly be. So this is outside the range of brawlers. So if the Scram-Kiter is able to keep his range at 7 to 8 kilometers, and usually these weapon systems have an optimal range close to this number. If they're able to stay away from the brawling ship is not able to hit them while they're still applying all their damage. So the Scram-Kiter will usually win in that matchup. Whereas if the brawler is able to close range, if it's able to close in on the Scram-Kiter and get on top of him, the brawler is going to win. And the Scram-Kiter almost always fits a Warp Scrambler and a Web. These are basically required, and they usually fit an Afterburner II, at least in low sec. Because range control is so important for these ships. They need to be able to shut off the Microwarpdrives of their opponents. They need the Web to slow them down, and they need their Afterburner to be able to help control their range to keep their speed up. The last class of ship are the point range kiters. So these are ships that have there are a couple possibilities. They could either be range bonus lasers, like a Slicer. A Slicer is pretty unique in that sense because they have a very large optimal range bonus to lasers, which allow them to hit out to the edge of warp disruptor range. Also, light missile ships are very typical point range kiters. A classic example is a Condor, although a Breacher and a Kestrel can also be fit this way. But the Condor is almost always fit with light missiles, at least from what I've seen. Also, drone ships like the Tristan. The Tristan is very commonly fit as a point range kiter. And what a point range kiter is basically doing is they're trying to stay outside of web and scram range. They're trying to stay as far away from the target as they can while still being within point range. So their ideal range is typically within 15 to 28 kilometers. They want to be outside of heated web range, which is 13 kilometers, but inside warp disruptor range, so their target can't warp away. And these always fit. They basically just want it to be as fast as possible. They want to fit a Microwarpdrive, and they want to fit a warp disruptor. So as an example for this video, I've been flying an Executioner that's fit with beam lasers. So I'll talk a little bit more about this ship, specifically about why I think it's good, and about how it matches up against other targets. So I think what makes the Executioner really good is two things. It's very, very good at controlling range. I've kind of fit it with an Afterburner Scram and a Web, which is kind of a typical low-sec faction warfare fit. And those mods make it very good at controlling range. And also, with its speed with the heated T2 Afterburner is 1736 meters per second, which is quite good as far as frigates go. It's faster than almost every other afterburning T1 frigate. I think the only ones that are faster are the Slasher and the Atron. It also does very, very good DPS. With small focus beam lasers and multi-frequency crystals, it does 193 DPS at 8.3 kilometers optimal range. And this amount of DPS at this range is just outstanding by the standards of T1 frigates. And this optimal range is also very conveniently, like almost right at the edge of scram range, which is the range that you want to be at. It also has the option of switching to longer range crystals, and if you switch to infrared crystals, just as an example, you can do 113 DPS at 20 kilometers optimal range. And why this is relevant is that you can use this to your advantage in order to hit long range kiting ships. So if you get caught by a point range kiting ship, which you otherwise are not fast enough to tackle, you can switch to longer range crystals and just try to fight them to a draw that way or chase them off. Whereas if you're in a pulse laser fit executioner, you have no way to deal any damage beyond, say, 11 kilometers, so you're kind of screwed in that case. And also you do much less damage at this range with pulse lasers with scorts than you would with beam lasers with an executioner. I think that's just a reflection of the buff that CCP did to beam lasers, because beam lasers used to be so bad. They used to do so much less DPS than this, but with the buff to small beams, they not only raised their DPS by a lot, but they made them much easier to fit than they were before. And I think people just haven't caught up to this completely yet. And which brings me to my third point, which is that for a long time, I think the Executioner was considered to be pretty bad, at least in low sec. It really wasn't that terrible, I think, but it wasn't as good as some other Scram-Kiting ships because it really didn't do that much damage. At least, certainly not nearly as much damage as it does now. But I think it still has a reputation for being bad, and because people think it's bad, more people are willing to fight you. I mean, nobody's gonna run away from an Executioner, and I think that's just really important, because if you try to like get fights with like a fuck off ship, like a Hawk or a Sentinel or something, I mean, nobody's going to want to fight a ship like that unless they have like a massive advantage against you. But everybody's going to want to fight an Executioner, so you're going to have no problem at all getting fights if you fly this ship. The disadvantages of an Executioner are, I think, twofold. One is that the tank of this ship is not very good. It has a very thin buffer as far as frigates go. And while it does have an active tank from an ancillary armor repper, it's really not that great. It's not as strong as like some like active tank bonus ships like an Incursus, for example. So you have to keep this in mind. You have to make sure that you stay away from brawling ships when you're flying this ship, because if you close in on a blaster ship or you allow them to get on top of you, you're going to die very fast, because you just really don't have the ability to tank very much. The second disadvantage is that lasers are locked into doing EM and thermal damage. You can't do any other damage type, and this is kind of bad versus armor, because these are an armor tank's highest base resists usually are against EM and thermal, and it's extremely bad against Minmatar T2 ships, because a Minmatar T2 ship will have something like 90% EM resist, especially if it's armor tanked, which is just very bad for you. So you have to keep that in mind if you ever consider fighting a wolf or something. And these last 2 points are they're not really disadvantages of this ship per se, but they're a reflection of how I fit it, more or less, because the Executioner, when fit with an Afterburner Scram Web, it can fight outclassed. Like, it can fight destroyers, it can fight assault frigates, if it's able to get the right matchup. But it can't fight multiple targets. It's not able to do any grid separation or anything like that, because it's really just not fast enough with an Afterburner. It's kind of built with 1 versus 1 fights in mind, so you can't really expect to win a 2 versus 1 in this ship unless you're able to do some either really creative separation using plexes, or your opponents are just bad, quite frankly. It's with an Afterburner, it's very difficult to slingshot and tackle Microwarpdrive long-range kiting ships unless they make a very big mistake. Usually if they just hit orbit 20 kilometers and go AFK, it's usually kind of difficult to slingshot ships unless you time it perfectly, which I kind of consistently fail at least with Afterburner ships. So that's kind of like a matchup that you want to avoid, or at least you want to set it up in such a way that you're able to land your scram. Because if you can't, then you're kind of you're not in a good place. Let's put it that way. So now let's talk about the skills that you need to train if you want to fly an Executioner. I think an Executioner, more so than most frigates, is actually able to succeed with fairly low SP. And the reason I think that is because it has very good base DPS and very good range and very good base speed, like almost without much skills. Um, so what skills kind of give you, like the big thing skills give you are more damage, and in terms of and from navigation skills you get more speed. Those are, I think, the biggest things. I mean, our taking skills can help somewhat, but they usually don't dramatically affect your ship's performance as much as adding damage skills does. So the first thing you need are just basic fitting skills. You need power grid management 5, you need CPU management 5, weapon upgrades 5, and a couple levels of advanced weapon upgrades. I think you only need advanced weapon upgrades to 1 or 2 in order to use the fit that I was using. But these are just important skills anyway. You just need to train these no matter what ship you're flying, so just make sure you train your fitting skills. The next thing is thermodynamics. Thermodynamics lets you overheat your mods, which I think training thermodynamics 1 is the single biggest increase to the strength of your ship from any skill that you can get. Quite frankly, so thermodynamics is a must. You have to train this skill. Definitely get it to 1. I would recommend getting it to 4, I guess sooner rather than later, but you definitely need to train this. You also need T2 weapons, because T2 weapons are much better than all the T1 variants. So you need to train small energy weapons to 5 and small beam laser specialization to 1 just to get access to T2 small beam lasers. I would strongly recommend also training a Frigate 5. 4 is kind of acceptable. I mean, I would go out and fight things if I only had to train to 4, particularly in an Executioner, but usually the hull skill gives a very significant bonus to flying the ship, and the Executioner is no different, so I strongly recommend training a Frigate to 5. And a Frigate 5 is needed to fly all the T2 Amar ships, like the Malediction or the Crusader or the Retribution, which are all very good ships, so it's definitely not a waste of time to train this to 5. I would do that as soon as you can. I would also make it one of your goals to get basic navigation skills to 4. These skills include the navigation, afterburner, acceleration control, and high-speed maneuvering. High-speed maneuvering is not like super important for this ship in particular, but you definitely want to get that skill anyway. And you definitely want Afterburner 4, because Afterburner 4 gets you access to T2 Afterburners, which are much better than all the T1 variants and give you a pretty significant speed boost. And navigation's only a tier 1 skill, so it doesn't take long to train that at all, and I think it's just really nice to have. You also want basic gunnery skills to 4, especially the ones that help you deal more damage. These are gunnery, rapid firing, surgical strike, and sharpshooter. Although sharpshooter is a little bit less important. This skill increases your optimal range, but the base optimal range of beam lasers is already pretty good, so you don't necessarily need to make this one a high priority, at least not in the short term. But you definitely want to get these other 3 skilled up to 4 as soon as you can, because they just help you deal more damage, and more damage is always good, just in any matchup. A disadvantage of lasers is that the lasers use a lot of capacitor, and the Executioner is actually a fairly capacitor hungry ship, especially with beam lasers. Beam lasers use a lot of capacitor, so I strongly recommend getting capacitor skills to 4. And eventually you'll want your capacitor skills to 5, but you can make that a longer term goal, I guess. But I would definitely look at getting up to 4 soon. The 3 skills in particular are capacitor management, capacitor systems operation, and controlled bursts. Controlled bursts is actually under gunnery. It helps. What it does is it makes your weapons use less capacitor, but because the beam lasers use a lot of capacitor, and actually most of your use is going to be from your guns, so I think you should train this to 4 if you're going to be using laser ships a lot. I think it's important. And you also want armor taking skills. You want to be able to fit a T2 tank to any armor tanking ship you fly, not just the Executioner. So you want to get hull upgrades 5, mechanics 5, and repair systems 5. Those are all very, very important skills. So now I'll talk a little bit about the specific matchups you might encounter in the Executioner and what to do in each one. The Executioner is actually a very, very simple ship to pilot, and that's why I think it's good for people who are just starting off in solo PvP, because basically it kind of almost doesn't really matter what you're fighting, your goal is kind of the same. You want to scram-kite your target. Basically what you do is you just keep at range at about 7.5 kilometers with your Afterburner on, try to land your scram and web, and then just shoot your target with multi-frequency crystals until they die. That's just really what it comes down to in just about every matchup that you'll face. Against Brawlers, it's usually a pretty easy win. Scram-kiting is very easy against Microwarpdrive fit Brawlers because your scram will shut off their prop mod, so you'll be able to keep range very easily. And even against other Afterburner fit Brawlers, you usually have an advantage because the Executioner has very good base speed, so it's going to be faster than most other Afterburner Brawlers, and it's going to be able to control range very well. Against Microwarpdrive Kiters, basically what you want to do is you want to try to land your scram and web, and then keep range at 7.5 kilometers with multi-frequency crystals loaded. That's ideal. I mean, the whole idea of a Microwarpdrive Kiter is to not get tackled, so if you have difficulty tackling them, then what you want to do is switch to infrared crystals, which will allow you to hit them out to 20 kilometers, and then you just kind of hope for the best while you try to slingshot them. If you are able to slingshot and tackle them, then you'll just switch to multi-frequency and then try to do as much damage as you can at a range of 7.5 km. Because getting tackle is so important in this matchup, it's usually better to avoid fighting these kinds of ships if they're set up in a faction warfare plex waiting for you, because they kind of they're most likely just going to be orbiting the beacon at 20 kilometers, and you'll have a very difficult time tackling them. It's kind of almost the worst matchup for you. But if you're able to set up the fights in your favor so that you're able to start the fight at a 0 range and get tackle immediately, then it's going to be a very easy win. And the third kind of matchup is just a mirror match against other Scram-Kiters, and then this situation is what I call a DPS race. A DPS race is basically you and your opponent are right at each other's optimal range, and you're just shooting at each other, and it's basically just a race to who can do the most DPS or against their opponent in as fast as they can. So that's basically it. So go into more detail about fighting against Brawlers. There's basically two kinds of Brawlers, I guess in a very general sense. There are slow Brawlers and fast Brawlers. Examples of slow Brawlers are like Merlin, the Incursus, and a Rifter. And these are really your ideal targets in an Executioner, because you're going to be much faster than them, so you're going to be able to control range. And a Merlin and the Incursus, even if they're fit with neutron blasters, are not going to be able to hit beyond 6 km with null ammo, so you're going to be able to outrange them very easily. And although a Rifter does have a fall-off bonus with autocannons, they're going to be fairly deep in the fall-off at the edge of scram range, so they're going to do much less DPS than your lasers will, so they're going to lose a DPS race. Fast Brawlers, on the other hand, can be very dangerous because these ships are faster than you, and specifically these are the Slasher and the Atron. So you're not going to be able to control range against these. They're going to be able to close the range against you. And if the fight starts in brawling range, if it starts at 0, then you're going to be in trouble because they're going to be inside the tracking of your guns, and they're just going to do a lot more damage than you. So you're going to lose in that sense. So what you want to do is you want to make sure the fight starts at the edge of scram range. You want the fight to start at 8 kilometers so that they have to spend as much time as possible burning into you, and that whole time, while they're trying to get close to you and they're trying to apply their damage, you're going to be applying all your damage with your lasers. So you want them to spend as much time burning in so that hopefully by the time they get into their optimal range, it's going to be too late and you're going to be able to win. And the other thing that's really important against ships that are like this, that are going to be faster than you, is to heat your afterburner. Make sure your afterburner is heated, because then if they're not heating their afterburner, you're actually going to have the speed advantage, and then it becomes actually a very easy win. But if they counter heat, then again you lose that advantage, but you'll still be able to, I guess it'll still take more time for them to burn in to you, so you should always heat your afterburner in this kind of matchup. These two particular ships can also be fairly dangerous, because the Slasher in particular, they often have a Newt in their high slot, and they have a tracking disruptor. And both of those things are just really, really bad for an Executioner. I mean, an Executioner is very capacitor hungry, so if they get Newted out, then they're basically going to lose just very quickly. And a tracking disruptor, an Executioner gets all their damage from their guns, and beam lasers don't have great tracking, so a tracking disruptor just really hurts an Executioner that's fit with beams really badly, especially because the Slasher also has a very small sig radius, so you already have some tracking issues, and with a tracking disruptor it gets even worse. Also, the Atron has a fall-off bonus to blasters, so they don't have to get as close to you as like an Incursus would in order to apply damage, which can also make this matchup a little bit problematic. So Merlin and Incursus Rifter, I think, are very easy wins for an Executioner. A Slasher and an Atron are more dangerous, but they're still very beatable. But you just have to be aware of the dangers of facing these two ships. So I'll show a couple examples of fights against Brawlers here with my Executioner. First up here is a fight against a Blaster Incursus. He was inside a Plex, so I just taken the gate here to go fight him. I land about 6.5k off of him, which is almost perfect, so I just very quickly turn my Afterburner on, land my Scram and Web, and just start shooting him with multi-frequency. Always want to make sure your guns are heated, and you can just see how great the damage of beam lasers are here, because I just very quickly get him into low armor. But the Incursus does have a rep bonus, and he is able to take my damage pretty well, but you see that even though he has neutron blasters, I'm well outside of his range, and I'm much faster than him, so I'm able to control range pretty easily. So, like I said, this is almost an ideal matchup for this Executioner, and it's a pretty simple win against a blaster ship like this. So here's another very similar fight against another Incursus, and it's kind of the same. Land at 5k, which is a pretty good range, turn my Afterburner on, lock him up, Scram Web on, and just start shooting him. At this point I'm pretty safe. I'm able to control range pretty well, and I'm going to win this fight. So you might notice I pretty much always heat my guns. You want to do as much damage as fast as possible in case any help arrives, even if you're very sure that you're going to win. I also pretty much always heat my Scram. That increases its range to, I think, just under 10k, and it makes it more difficult for him to escape or to slingshot out of my Scram range and warp away. Web, it's not really necessary to heat once you've got an initial tackle, but I always make sure to heat my guns and my Scram. So let's go over the next type of matchup, which is fighting against other Scram-Kiters. Like I mentioned before, fights between two Scram-Kiters results in what I like to call a DPS race, where you're basically both built for fighting each other at 7.5 kilometers, so you're both applying your full damage. You're both right at the range you want to be at, and it's pretty much just a straight DPS versus EHP race on both sides. In this case, the outcome depends on a few things. It depends on the damage type of each ship and the tank and resist profile on each ship, such as armor versus shield tanking. For the Executioner, just to use the Executioner as an example, it's doing mostly EM damage, so would ideally want to fight other shield tank ships if it's locked into a DPS race, and it would want to be fighting also be fighting against something which is doing EM damage because it's an armor tank ship, and that's going to be its highest resist. The outcome also depends on fitting choices made between the two ships, so usually the ship with a better fit will win, just in the mirror match against another Scram-Kiter. And the next thing, which I think is actually probably the most important, is just piloting ability and reaction times. If you're in a DPS race, you always want to overheat your guns because they give you a very big edge. You want to overheat your guns, and you also want to overheat any active tank modules that you're using, like your Ancillary armor repper. And you want to use hotkeys to give you just as fast of a reaction time as possible, so that you just get a little bit of an edge that way. And finally, the last thing, if all other things are equal, then skill points do come into play, although not very often in my experience. In the mirror match, where everybody is piloting equally well, then the person with more skill points will have an edge, I mean, pretty obviously. And also implants, I guess, in that sense, in the same way. Although, yeah, so skill points and implants, I guess, is the last thing. To be fair, all things being equal, the Executioner is typically not favored to win a DPS race against slower, more tankier scram-kiting frigates, because one of the Executioner's advantages over slower hulls is just its speed, and because it's faster, it trades off some of its tanking and EHP ability. And because of that, just in a DPS race against tankier ships, it's usually not favored. But the advantage is that because it's faster, if you see that you're losing, you can usually just disengage or run away and just warp off if you're losing. But the last point here, even though if on paper you're not always favored to win, people do make mistakes. People don't fit their ships well. People don't react fast sometimes. And because of that, you can just very often just win anyway. So if you think you're going to be, if you see another scram-kiting ship, I would just always go for it, because there's a good chance if you just play well that you'll just win anyway. So let's go over some examples of fights against other scram-kiting ships. This here is going to be against a Tormentor. I'm just waiting inside of a Plex for him. And a Tormentor is actually very similar to an Executioner, except that it's slower but it's tankier and it does more damage. So it's just a better pure combat ship, I think. But you can see here I just locked him up very quickly and just used my hotkeys to land my tackle and start shooting him right away. And it took him a much longer time to lock me up and even get his drones on me. So he was actually already in half armor by the time he started shooting me, which just gave me a very significant edge in this fight that he really couldn't recover from. You can see here I'm heating my guns, I'm heating my repper, and we're just in a straight DPS race here. And it is fairly close. Like I said, a Tormentor is a much better combat ship than an Executioner is. But just this few seconds I gained at the start of the fight gave me an advantage. So here's another really close fight here against a Kestrel. And a Kestrel is actually pretty dangerous against an Executioner because they do very good damage and they get full damage type selection. And they have a fairly good buffer tank too. And this Kestrel actually turned out to be an armor Kestrel, which is a thing, it's legit. And it's actually even worse for me then, because then his EM resist is much better than the shield Kestrels would be. So this fight's really close. Like I said, the Kestrel I think is just a much better pure combat ship than an Executioner is. But I'm still able to just, I guess, narrowly win this fight. I just hope that shows just how strong a beam Executioner is. third kind of matchup that you'll find in faction warfare are against Microwarpdrive kiting ships. And this is the kind of matchup which is actually very bad for an Afterburner fit Executioner. The best you can usually hope for is a draw, unless they make a fairly big mistake. These ships will typically wait inside of a plex for people to come fight them, and they usually orbit about 20 kilometers from the beacon, which is about their optimal range. And they're much faster than any Afterburner fit ship, and so it's very difficult for an Afterburner fit frigate to tackle them. So you have two options here. If you find yourself in this matchup in an Afterburner fit Executioner, you can hit them if you switch to longer range crystals. So I always carry a set of infrared crystals in my Executioner. And although you do much less damage, you're able to hit out to 20 kilometers. And typically a Microwarpdrive kiting ship also doesn't do very much damage, and they also have a fairly low EHP, usually. I mean, not always, but usually. And so that at least means that you can be potentially competitive against them, and you can potentially force them to run away, or fight them to a draw that way. The three most common ships that of this type are the Slicer, the Tristan, and the Condor. And the Slicer is something that you should just never ever fight. I would never ever fight a Slicer with a beam Executioner, at least not willingly, because even if you do tackle them, they still do a lot of damage, so you still stand a very good chance of losing. And the Condor, Condor is also not ideal because they have 4 mid slots, and a Condor is very often fit a tracking disruptor or a dual tracking disruptor or dual damps. And if they're fit in such a way, that kind of results in a matchup that you really have no chance of winning at all, unless they make a very big mistake, of course. But this type of ship is basically a hard counter to you, so it's usually just better to avoid fighting it unless you're sure that they're bad or you're sure that you can get tackle on them. Breachers and Kestrels can also be fit for Microwarpdrive kiting, although these are less common than the rocket type of fits in my experience. And these can also both fit a tracking disruptor, so it's at least something that you should also be aware of. The Breacher and the Kestrel can be fit in a similar way to the Condor. That leaves a Tristan. Tristan is something that I would engage, I guess, more freely. Tristan, even if they're fit for Microwarpdrive kiting, they usually are shield tanked, which is, I guess, better against the damage type that you do. Better for you, at least. And they usually don't fit a tracking disruptor. I mean, very rarely do they fit a tracking disruptor. And also Tristans are very versatile. They're not always fit for my long-range kiting. They can be fit for like Scram-Kiting too, and that's a much better matchup for you. So Tristan is something I would engage more freely. So here's an example of a fight against a Microwarpdrive kiting Tristan. So I took the gate into this Tristan, and when I landed on the beacon here, I saw immediately that he's 20 kilometers off the beacon, and his speed very quickly goes up, so he clearly has a Microwarpdrive, so he's clearly a Microwarpdrive kiting ship. So I tried to see if I could just very quickly get an overheated web on him, but it turns out I can't. So my only option here is to switch to long-range crystals and just try to fight back. I kind of tried to slingshot him. You can see here, and my attempts are honestly pretty bad. But as I mentioned, if you're fit with an Afterburner, it's very difficult to get close enough to get tackle on a Microwarpdrive kiting ship. But you can see he makes a pretty big mistake here. So even though he's not tackled at all, he's making no attempt to run away, and he's losing a DPS race against me, and he gets killed even though he could have just run away at any time. So that doesn't happen every day, but it's a pretty good outcome. So other T1 frigates are not the only thing that are out there, and they're not the only thing. You don't have to limit yourself to fighting them. destroyers and assault frigates in many cases are engageable and are often actually beatable if you get the right matchup. So I want to go over quickly which of these ships you can fight and which ones you shouldn't fight. In terms of destroyers, if you ever see a catalyst that's fit with blasters or a thrasher that's fit with autocannons, these are very engageable ships. They're brawling range ships. They're much slower than you. And well, yes, if they're fit very well, they should probably still beat you. Very often they're not fit well. So if I ever see a catalyst or a thrasher, I would engage them, and I would expect that you have a very good chance of winning. And even if you think you're losing, like I said, your speed is much better, so you can disengage in many cases. A ship that you can maybe fight, that I would consider fighting, is if you see a cormorant that's fit with blasters. A cormorant's more dangerous than the catalyst, even though it does less damage because it gets a double range bonus. So with null ammo, a blaster cormorant can actually hit just fine out to the edge of scram range. And that would be my only reservation to fighting one. But it's really common for people to not carry null ammo for some reason. So a cormorant that only has void still can't hit out to the edge of scram range. So I would consider maybe fighting a blaster cormorant, but I would probably look up the pilot's kill board and to try to get an idea of how good he is. The ships that you should not fight, I think, unless unless you think they're badly fit or fit for PvE or something, a Dragoon, a Course, or an Algos, a Corax, or a Tower are ships that I would just not fight, unless you're sure that they're badly fit or the pilots are bad or inexperienced. You just really have no realistic chance of beating any of these. And also, although you can beat a blaster catalyst and an autocannon thrasher, a rail catalyst or cormorant or artillery thrasher are things that you should just not fight. You really just can't beat these ships. In terms of assault frigates, it's kind of a similar story. Assault frigates in some cases are very beatable. In some cases they're not. So I would fight a Blaster Enyo as a ship that I would fight. And an autocannon Wolf or an autocannon Jaguar are also ships that I would engage. Assault frigates are somewhat less common in faction warfare than T1 frigates and faction frigates, and I find that a lot of people who fly assault frigates, especially the Enyos, Wolves, and Jaguars, for some reason are just not very good, or they're just using badly fit ships. So these are, I think, the three ships that you can have a good chance of beating. And this is even in spite of the fact that the Wolf and Jaguar have ginormous EM resistance, like 90% EM resistance, which is really, really bad for an Executioner. But if you're able to Scram-Kite them and they're not fit well, or they're not carrying barrage ammo, then you can still win. It's definitely worth trying. And like I said, if you find yourself losing, you're faster than these ships, so you can always just disengage and run away, just warp off. A ship that I would maybe consider fighting is a Blaster Harpy. A Blaster Harpy is kind of the assault frigate analog to the Cormorant in that it has a very good optimal range bonus, but I've beaten Harpies with Scram-Kiting T1 frigates before simply because the Harpy pilot wasn't carrying any null ammo, and if they're not carrying null ammo, then they can't hit out to the edge of scram range. So I think it's worth a shot, but it's kind of a matchup that I would expect to lose. But an Executioner killing a Harpy is a really, really good win if you're able to pull it off. In terms of which ones you should not fight, I would never fight a Hawk. I would never fight a Retribution or a Vengeance or an Ishkur with an Executioner. I think even if they're not optimally fit, I think they'll probably still beat an Executioner. I mean, it's just not a good matchup for you. And also an Enyo, Wolf, or a Jaguar that are fit with longer range weapons are also not something that you should fight. You just can't win a DPS race against those ships. Faction frigates and pirate frigates are also very common in faction warfare. Um, just to be clear, I would expect to lose against any faction frigate or pirate frigate. Um, I mean, I would recommend that before engaging these, that you just try to scout your opponent or try to look up their kill board. Just try to gather as much information as you can about how they're fit. Um, but the ones I'd be most likely to engage, which I would fight, but I'd still probably expect to lose, are against a Blaster Comet or an Autocannon Firetail. Um, I mean, this is a matchup that's very similar to just any other brawling T1 frigate, except that these ships are a little bit faster than just regular T1 frigates, and they do more damage. So they're still beatable, but I guess you're just less likely to win. Uh, but it would still be a very good win for an Executioner. The only pirate frigate I think that you're most likely to win against is a Cruor. Because a Cruor is the only thing that's really dangerous about the Cruor are newts. They can basically alpha your cap if they're able to start the fight within newt range. But if you're able to stay out of newt range, you're faster than the Cruor, and you're able to match their DPS. So you stand a good chance of winning a DPS race. And their web bonus doesn't really matter that much, honestly. So I think a Cruor is pretty engageable. Ones I would maybe fight are Dramiel and Estero. I mean, it's not really that realistic to beat a Dramiel, to be honest. But a lot of times they're not fit very well, or or they're just not floating very well. So you can kind of treat it like a super slasher almost. And if you're able to, say, overheat your Afterburner and keep range away from it, you can win. It's not likely, but it's possible, I guess. And Asteros are not really something that you should beat, but often they're kind of fit for like half exploration and half combat. And if they're fit that way, then you can win. But if they're just fit for like max combat capability, then they can kind of, like, if they're dual rep or something like that, then they can perma tank all your DPS and you just can't win. So against a Dramiel or Estero, I would look up the pilot's kill board, and then I would maybe consider fighting them, but it's possible to win, but not likely, let's say. But the ships you should absolutely not fight under any circumstances, unless you're sure that they're just bad pilots, are a Rail Comet or Artillery Firetail, are things that you really can't beat. I mean, these ships are just kind of the premier, especially the Rail Comet now, is kind of the premier Scram-Kiting T1 frigate, so you just can't expect to beat it with an Executioner. It's just not going to happen. Similar story with an Artillery Firetail, although it's not quite as strong as a Comet in my opinion, but it's still much better than an Executioner. A Slicer and a Hookbill, I think, are also ships that I would never fight. A Slicer is just very, very strong. And it's a very, very good point range kiting ship, which any point range kiting ship is kind of already a hard counter to an Afterburner fit Executioner. But I think even if you're able to tackle a Slicer, even within scram range, I think they can still win. That's just how good a Slicer is. So you can't really expect to beat a Slicer. And a Hookbill too is also very dangerous. It's just like it's a Kestrel with an extra mid-slat, basically, and they're very commonly fit with tracking disruptors, or they're fit with double webs, or dual prop, or something like that, and it's just not something that you can beat, so I wouldn't even try. I would not engage a Hookbill. And also the rest of the pirate frigates, I would just forget about it. I mean, a Succubus, a Daredevil, a Worm, or a Garmer are just not things that you can beat realistically, unless you're sure that the pilots are bad, or the fit is bad, or they're just not very experienced players, or you're able to just get some advantage. But just in a regular fight, you just can't beat any of these ships. the single most important thing you can do in order to help you find fights and win fights is to do scouting and intel. And this can be done in several different ways, and it's especially important if you're trying to engage above your ship class. Like you're trying to fight destroyers, or you're trying to fight assault frigates, or you're trying to fight pirate frigates. That this is really important and can not only give you an edge in the fight, but let you know whether you should take the fight in the first place. The first point here is to use local and D-scan. So obviously local lists all the pilots that are in the system with you, and D-scan lets you know where they are. So you can use D-scan to check all the faction warfare plexes and the asteroid belts for targets. I usually start off by checking all the faction warfare plexes because usually that's where people are. But if you can't find a target at a plex, it's often worth checking asteroid belts, because sometimes you find people and destroyers who are belt ratting or something, and they're usually pretty easy kills. Also, many people don't rename their ships, and if they don't rename their ship, then you instantly can match up the ship to the pilot, and that can give you a fairly big advantage. And if you know who's flying the ship, you can check their character info and corp history just by double-clicking on the pilot in the list in local. I usually check a person's corp history just to see how old the pilot is. Older players have more SP. I mean, I guess that's the strongest correlation. And usually, although not always, but usually an older player will have more PvP experience, but honestly, I wouldn't let that scare you, because most people, a lot of people are bad. Even older players can be bad. So yeah. And also, if you see anybody who's just sitting in a faction warfare plex, usually they're going to be in one of the militias. They're just trying to either offensive plex or defensive plex and try to make ISK. Most people who are not in plexes but are looking for fights don't just sit in a plex to wait people to come fight them, because that's boring. And there's no like associated benefit to doing that like there is for people who are actually in faction warfare. So you can usually safely assume that somebody who's just sitting in a plex is going to be in one of the militias. And why is that important? All this is important because if you can match a ship in space to a particular pilot, and you can look up their kill board, and try to determine what fit they're using, because most people will fly the same ships and just use the same fit over and over and over again. So if you check their kill boards, you can usually see what their fit is. If you're able to gather all this information, it gives you a very, very big advantage in the fight. And most of the time when people just see you, they're just going to see an Executioner coming after them, and they're not going to know any more than that. I mean, you can kind of safely assume how an Executioner is going to be fit, but not always. But it's very important to do this, especially if you're trying to engage ships above your class and you want to have a realistic chance of winning. This is just very, very important. It's a very, very powerful tool that you can use to your advantage. So I think I'll end this video with a couple more fights. First, I saw a Thrasher on D-scan, so I was able to use D-scan to track him down to asteroid belts. I saw that he was trying to belt rat, and because he didn't rename his ship, I could kind of see that he was a fairly new player or fairly inexperienced. So I just went straight for it without any hesitation whatsoever. And a Thrasher, like I said, is one of the destroyers that you have a very good chance of beating. So you can see he doesn't even try to fight back, and it's just a very quick kill. In a similar way, a Succubus was one of the ships, if you remember, I said is one that you should just never, ever, ever fight. But I looked up this pilot's kill board, and I saw that this guy just loses pretty badly fit succubuses all the time. So, I mean, just based on that, just based off looking at his kill board, I just went straight for it. And it just turned out to be a very easy win. So like I said, I mean, if you had nothing else to go on, if you didn't have kill boards to go by, I would just, I guess, just pass this up. But it turned out to just be a very easy kill, and a very nice kill, actually, that I was able to take just by gathering intel. So now here I'm taking a Plex into a Cruer, and like I said, a Cruer is a ship that you can usually fight. The only danger is that you get neuted out. But I checked this pilot's kill board as well, and I just saw that he actually doesn't fit newts to his Cruers. He fits Nosferatus, and that means that he can't alpha my cap out if I land at 0 on the beacon like a newt fit Cruer could. And so because of that, he really poses no threat to me whatsoever. It's almost like I was fighting another Executioner and not a pirate frigate. So you can see this fight is starting off fairly one-sided. I kind of played this pretty badly because I saw that he had a buddy in the system with him who was in a Comet, and I saw on D-Scan that he was going to come and try to help him, so I just tried to line out and warp away. I was kind of thinking of saving my own ship here. But then I saw the Cruer was almost dead, so I was like, okay, what the hell am I doing? Let's get back in here and finish this guy off. So I do that, but I made a mistake in not locking up the Comet right away. And because of that, he's able to get on top of me. I think if I had locked the Comet up as soon as he entered the Plex and just gotten a web on him, I think I could have gotten out. 100% I could have saved my own ship there. So I really believe that pretty much anybody can be a good solo PvPer if you just put in a little bit of effort and you just try to learn how to do it. Lowsec is really a great place to get started with solo PvP, and I really think that the best way to learn is to just go out there and do it. Just buy a bunch of ships, fit them all out, and just go out there and try to find fights. And I hope this video just helps you learn how to do it, and will help you pick your fights. It's very important that you, as you lose ships, that you try to learn from each one of your losses. And I think what helps with this more than anything else is if you record all your fights, you fraps all your fights, and you review them, and you try to understand why you lose or why you win. I also suggest there's a chat channel in EVE called PvP and Piracy Help, where some very experienced solo PvPers congregate and will answer any questions that you might have. I very highly recommend it. Or you can EVE mail either one of my PvP characters if you ever want any fits or help, and I'll try to respond as quickly as I can. So thanks for watching.